Buon pomeriggio, ben ritrovati, buon anno. Questo è il nostro primo webinar appunto del 2019 e ho il piacere di avere qui con noi oggi Rachel Robert.
Hello.
Rachel oggi parlerà del debate, del dibattito, un argomento che sta diventando man mano sempre più interessante e applicato anche nelle nostre scuole italiane. Vedremo un po' magari come, così, quali esempi pratici poter prendere, insomma, poter attuare in classe. Ricordo come sempre alcune comunicazioni di servizio, quindi durante il webinar potrete sempre scrivere delle domande, avete una barra sul lato destro del vostro computer, del vostro desktop, sul punto di domanda, una volta cliccato potrete appunto aprire la finestra domande e chat. Nella finestra domande potrete appunto redigere queste domande a cui poi Rachel risponderà alla fine della sessione. Inoltre tra 2 o 3 giorni riceverete un'email con all'interno un questionario a cui rispondere, cui per me è molto importante. Previa compilazione di questo questionario, poi appunto vi sarà inviato sempre per email il diploma appunto di partecipazione, l'attestato di partecipazione. Inoltre sempre tra 2 o 3 giorni sul sito di mondadorieducation.it potrete scaricare la presentazione e il video di questo webinar, eventualmente anche i handout che accompagnano appunto l'intervento di Rachel. Ringrazio Mondadori Education, naturalmente, Macmillan Education e Rachel Roberts per oggi per essere qui e ora lascio appunto la parola a Rachel. So Rachel, it's now over to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you everybody for taking part today. Let me move on to my first slide, which is the title of today's debate, which is of the webinar, which is Debating in Class from a Language Tool to a Life Skill. And I hope that this title includes every aspect to today's webinar, because I'll be talking about debating, what it means, why it's important, how it can be a really useful language tool for teachers to use in class, and how it can be a fundamental life skill for your students to use, okay? I'll be presenting you with lots of activities to prepare your students to do a debating class, a big event. There will be small activities, more complex activities. If you have any questions about how you could possibly do that, or if perhaps you've tried some similar activities in the past and had some trouble, please send in your questions, because as Sylvia said, there'll be time to respond to those questions at the end of my presentation, okay? So let's get on. First of all, what do we mean by debate? Well, obviously, it's a noun, meaning a formal discussion on a particular matter, a public meeting in which opposing arguments are put forward and which usually ends with a vote. Now, this is very important. Above all, the idea of it being a public meeting, because your students will have to speak in public in class, and this is something that can be very useful for them, also for their future careers, just learning how to speak in English in front of other people. The verb to debate means to argue about, discuss or talk through a subject, especially in a formal manner, and I'll be giving you lots of language for you to give to your students to help them do that in an effective way. So why do I think that debating in class is a language tool? Well, first and foremost, it's a great way to get your students talking. And whenever I give any kind of presentation or teacher training, I always say that speaking in class is absolutely fundamental, because when students use language they've learned, it moves that language from their passive memories, where they simply read something and understand it, or perhaps listen and understand, to actually being able to produce the language actively. So talking in any form, hopefully together, so pair work or group work, is fundamental, and organising a debate is a great way to do that in class. Having a debate is also very motivating, especially if the subject of your debate is something that's close to the students' hearts. It could be something to do with changes in their school curriculum, something to do with social media that they all use today. So they'll have a lot to say about that, and they'll probably want to talk about it. So if you give them something they want to talk about it, and they have to talk about it in English, then it's a win-win situation, okay? The other fantastic thing about debating in class is that it leads to a lot of other activities. Whether you are preparing your debate or whether you're using some consolidation activities at the end, for example, essay writing, it gives you so many spin-offs that you can use at other times during the course. Last but not least, it's fun. I can remember doing a debate in my class at school when I was about 16, and I still remember the debate. I remember the discussions we had. So, and I can remember that we all walked out of the lesson talking about the discussion, about the debate in an animated way. So if your students do that, then you've been successful, okay? And usually they really enjoy it and look forward to it. Now, why do I say that debating is a life skill? This is a photograph that I downloaded from the internet from a free site, and the title of this image is, wait for it, telecommuting is the future of work. Now, by telecommuting, we don't mean teletransportation, as in Star Trek, but the fact that in the future, many of the young people we teach today will perhaps work from home using video conferences, or they will go to offices close to their home, and they will increasingly work internationally by using video conferences. So this is something they definitely need for the future, and all the skills and activities you give them when you prepare for a debate will help them for this, okay? Whether or not you like this idea, this is what is coming. The other thing is, in that first photograph, it was a business situation. This is a photograph of the Novartis campus in Basel. I was in Switzerland 2 weeks ago, and I happened to have, I met somebody on a train and started speaking, and he told me that he worked in this building. It's a research facility, and he said the place is full of scientists, secretaries, researchers. Every single thing we do is in English. Now, this man was from Switzerland. His mother tongue was Swiss German, but at work he spoke and wrote and read in English all day long. And that's increasingly going to be the case in business situations, in educational research facilities, and in every different type of work. So I think that these kind of skills, it's so important that you're able to give these to your students right now, and debating is the best way to do it. Okay, so I can imagine that you're all thinking, that's fantastic. How do I do it? Where do I start? I've been trying to anticipate some of your questions. I can imagine you're wondering how to manage it with a large group of students. I know that many of you will have students of different levels in class, depending perhaps on the middle school that they went to. Some of them will be quite proficient, some of them will have a very low level. So I'll be giving you some activities and some tips on how to get them all working together. And we'll be looking at some of the basic tools we need, because after all, it's not just a debate you're organising, it's a debate in English, in the English language. And the key is to build up, to prepare for your debate in small stages, okay, with little activities that you can insert into your lessons, starting from tomorrow with some of them, building up in stages. And in this picture, I've chosen a picture where, you know, the team is helping perhaps the weaker student, because I think the other key to this is to use a lot of teamwork, okay, where you're mixing in stronger students working with weaker students. That is always a win-win situation, because the stronger students help the weaker ones, and the weaker students, and the stronger students also benefit, because explaining things to other people is the best way to consolidate what you know. Okay, let's start with the basics. Before you work towards a debate, the first thing they need is some language, some vocabulary. Now, imagine you have just concluded a unit in the course book you're using. For today, I thought about the example of the environment, because that's one subject I'm pretty sure is in most course books. So they've done the unit, and you want to make sure that they've learned all the necessary vocabulary related to the environment, so they can then talk about it during a discussion or a debate. Okay? Now, the temptation is to give them a written test, but I think there's a better way of doing that. And the best thing is for you to divide your class into teams, into small teams of 4 or 5 students, and ask them together, working together and collaborating, to write a list of as many words as possible connected to the environment. So they can think with no books available, no books, no dictionaries, to try and remember as much vocabulary as they can connected to the environment, and or whatever subject it is you've been studying. And you can remind them that they should make a list of expressions, words, nouns, verbs, adjectives they can use. And when you see that they've written a few words and they're beginning to slow down, you can give them some tips. You can walk around the room and say things like, well, what do you call the poisonous substances farmers put on their crops to protect attacks from insects? And hopefully they will write pesticides. Or you could say something like, what type of energy comes from nature and is not finite? Hopefully they will all write down renewable energy. What kind of different technological gadgets do we need to use that energy? We need things like solar panels, wind turbines, electric dams. Or you could say something like, what is the kind of rubbish that comes from factories and sometimes pollutes our water and our soil? And hopefully they will write something like toxic waste. So the idea is that you are just prompting them and helping them to remember the vocabulary they've used. At the end of the exercise, when they really can't think of anything else, you can see which team thought of the most words and ask them to share their words, so at the end, the very end of the exercise, all the students have as many words as possible. If you really want to, you can then give them a written test, but you will see that if they have done this oral team activity first, any written test will be much easier for them to perform. Okay, so first step, we've consolidated the basic vocabulary they need to talk about the subject, all right? The next thing they need, this doesn't have to be done on the same day, in the same lesson, this can be done at another time. The next thing they need is some language of debate and discussion. Now, here I've made a list of expressions for expressing an opinion, for agreeing and disagreeing, and you can find this again on the webinar, so you don't need to write these down now. But I suggest that you present this perhaps as a kind of a vocabulary exercise where the students have some columns and they have to put all the vocabulary into the correct columns. Something like this. So I believe is expressing an opinion, in my view is another way of doing it, expressions for disagreeing or agreeing, okay? This is something they can do in pairs. Again, you could mix the stronger students and the weaker students. Once they have learnt this important functional language for conducting a discussion or a debate, then they need to use it. And my favourite way of doing that is through some mini discussions, okay? Now, I have written some ideas here for some mini discussions, and you will see that some of them are complete. For example, I think students shouldn't start university before the age of 21. 16-year-olds should be able to vote. And some of them, they have to complete. For example, the best way to get people to use public transport is, or using tablets and smartphones in school, and they need to complete that with their own ideas. So you could put them into teams. Each individual student has a list of questions. The ideal thing would be for you to prepare some different sets of questions so that each team has a different set to work on, and they practice reading them, practice the pronunciation, and complete the phrases or sentences they need to complete together. These are flashcards, so they need to cut them up, or you can cut them up beforehand. And then when they've done that, how does it work? You mix up the teams and put them into pairs. At that point, it's very, very simple. Student A, who in this case can be the green man, reads one of his or her ideas. I don't think students should start university before 21. And student B has to listen very carefully and come up with an answer. For example, you're right, they need time to mature first, or something like that. Then student B reads one of his or her ideas, and student A has to respond. You know, I think students should be able to vote at 16. I don't agree. They don't know enough at that age. Now, to give you an idea of what happens in students' minds during this activity, I'm going to give you some other examples. For example, if I say to you, using tablets in school means that students don't develop their handwriting and as a consequence have bad handwriting, what would you answer? Think about it. You might say something like, yes, but it really saves a lot of weight because they don't need to carry heavy books. If you hear something like, the best way to get people to use public transport is to make it free of charge, what do you think? Well, maybe you think, I see what you mean, but it might be difficult to finance. So you can understand that even in this very, very simplistic activity, the students are having to do some active listening, which is a fundamental skill in a debate, and they're having to prepare their responses, okay? So the more often you do this, the better it is. And I would suggest an activity like that, you could repeat it first with one pair, then students swap and work with a second partner or a third partner. And so they get really used to this idea of giving a statement and then answering their partner's statements, okay? Now, apart from this discussion language, the language of agreeing and disagreeing, when you're actually giving a presentation, you also need to use some, what I call persuasive language. Obviously, on the day of the actual debate, the people giving the presentations will be trying to argue their case and persuading their classmates that their viewpoint is correct. So they need to be able to use this kind of language confidently. So during another lesson, during the course, you should try and teach them some of these ideas. Remember that this language is not only useful for presenting, it's also really useful for essay writing. One of the many things that I do is that I am an examiner, I'm an IELTS examiner, and I see that many Italian students, when they write their essays, have no idea about how to present the opposite point of view or how to write in a persuasive, convincing way. So debates in class will get them used to using this kind of language. Now, what do I mean by persuasive language? Well, things like debunking the opposite viewpoint. In other words, thinking about what the opposition will say, what your opponents will say, and counteracting that argument straight away. Something along the lines of, some people believe that tablets are fantastic in class because they save a lot of weight. However, it means that students no longer write by hand, they don't use their brain so much, and it's more easy for them to forget the information after the lesson. Something along those lines. Another thing they need to learn how to do is to use emotive language. This is a favorite politician's technique. Imagine you have given them a subject and I don't know, something about nuclear power and how it could be the solution to global warming. Certainly most of the students will probably be against nuclear power, I would imagine. So The poor students who have to argue in favour will have to really try and convince their classmates. So they need to say something like, the environment is really important to us, and we're convinced that nuclear power is the only way to beat global warming. We care about polar bears. Time is running out. All of this emotive language can be really important during a presentation. Now, how do you get them to do that? You can get them to do that with, oh, sorry, there's one more thing you need to do, of course, before we get to that. Using emotive language and also engaging the audience. As you build up to your presentations, it's very important that you know, when they are preparing for their presentations, that they learn to think about the key point, the main idea that they want to, the main message they want to give. And this is something they should repeat over and over again. And so various times during their presentations, they can say things like, in the end, the most important thing to remember is, for example, time is running out, or we need to think about a quick solution to global warming, etc., etc. So we've looked at different ways of using persuasive language. How do you practice it in class? Well, you practice that with mini presentations. Now, we had mini discussions. This is the next step up, okay? So imagine that you give the class, or rather, you divide your class into small groups, and each group has a little topic that they need to give a presentation on. The idea is they present and perform everything in small groups, so the situation is very comfortable for your students. It's non-threatening. They don't have to speak in public in front of the whole class yet. Okay, this will help the weaker, lower level students when they need to get a bit of confidence. So imagine one group has a topic such as, in the future, all school children will study from home via webinars, and they need to brainstorm this idea. They might say things like, webinars can save money because you don't have to maintain school buildings. Students can get up later. That could be a very convincing argument for their fellow students. Webinars can be accessible worldwide, so we could create international classrooms. How fantastic is that? On the opposite side, they might come up with things like, there's no teacher-student interaction in a webinar classroom. It's less easy to make friends, and it's difficult to do team or group work. Okay, so once your little groups have brainstormed all the ideas for and against their argument, then they need to write mini presentations, and they should do this together as a team. Each student needs a copy of the presentation, but they need to work on this together, because that way the weaker students can contribute with ideas, even if they're contributing less with the language, and they're involved from the very beginning. Once all your students have their little presentations prepared, you then need to mix them up, and they do a pair work, so hopefully they're working with a student from a different group with a different subject of a presentation. And very simply, one student will give his or her presentation to the other, using all the persuasive language, all the techniques and vocabulary they've learnt up to now. Something like, many people believe that if students studied at home via webinars, it would save money and energy, but actually it would have a negative effect on their ability to make friends. Now, while the first student is speaking, the other student should be listening actively, maybe making a few notes, because they have to respond with one question. It's very simple at this point, one question for their partner, which could be something like, but couldn't students socialize outside of school? And then student A has to respond with a brief answer, and then they swap roles, and student B gives his or her presentation. Student A listens, comes up with a question, and student B has to respond. If you have time, they can then swap, and you can build up the tension, if you like, because the first time they could just read their presentations if they feel uncomfortable. The second time they could use their presentations just as notes. If you manage to do it the third time during a lesson, they could try and do it from memory. You can imagine how all of those activities is fixing all the language in their active memories. Okay, so this is why debating is such a fantastic tool for learning English. So, okay, how do I schedule all of this into the curriculum? I have so much other stuff I need to be teaching them. My suggestion is that you think of the time you spend with your teachers or with your students as a whole, maybe over the 2 or 3 year period you'll be teaching them, and decide to schedule the big debates at key times of the year, okay? Which could be, I don't know, before Christmas, before Easter, before the summer, in such a way that over the entire period that you are teaching these students, everyone in the class gets to participate, gets to present during a presentation at least once, okay? And all of the other little activities we've seen up to now, you can begin to integrate as of tomorrow in your lessons, the vocabulary building. You can spend 15-20 minutes doing some language of discussion. You can then another day do some of the persuasive language. You can use that to write an essay with, okay? So just build up the vocabulary, the language, and the actual techniques during the year. And you can tell your students this is all leading up to a debate, okay? In such a way as to create a certain sense of anticipation before the big day. Now, what do? You need to choose a group of students who will be involved in the first presentation. Perhaps the best thing is to choose a group of fairly strong students at the beginning. So 3 or 4 students will be preparing the argument for, and 3 or 4 will be preparing the argument against. So you need to remember the discussion will be conducted as a real debate in class. So the arguments for and against need to be prepared in advance. You make 2 small groups of 3 or 4 students, and you present them with a thought-provoking statement, which could be something like, in 10 years' time, all cars will be driverless. Now, I quite like this particular theme for discussion because both sides of the arguments have a chance of winning the debate. Because even if we all agree that in the future cars will probably be driverless, it may not be in 10 years' time, it may be in 20 or 30 years' time. So the group of students that have to argue against this statement will have some ammunition. They have a chance of convincing their students that the world is not ready for driverless cars yet, okay? So you should give your 2 groups of presenters this question to prepare at home. As a homework, they go home, they brainstorm these questions, and they prepare their presentation as a group. Okay, the most important key points is that the preparation of the presentation has to be a group activity. There should be a mix of stronger and weaker students amongst the presenters, and each student in the group should give part of the presentation. How they give their presentation is up to you, and it's up to, I don't know what kind of means you have available in your schools, in your classrooms. Some visual materials would be fantastic. Certainly a little bit of research on internet to give some concrete examples to talk about during their presentations. If they can do a PowerPoint presentation, fantastic. But the crucial idea is that they are collaborating on the preparation of this presentation, and that all of the students should speak in front of the class. So that's what your presenters are doing. What about the others? Well, they also have to do a lot of work because they should also look at the topic of discussion and they should go home, read up about it so that they can prepare some questions. Because during the debate, they will not just be sitting there looking out of the window, they will be required to participate at the end. So they need to, even in small groups or pairs, prepare some questions to ask during the debate, okay? Something like, don't you think 10 years is a very long time in terms of technological development? Nowadays, technology changes every year. You know, they should think of some questions to ask both sides of the discussion. Okay, you have programmed the big day of the debate. The students arrive in class, and hopefully you will have a situation like this where your presenters stand at the front of the class and they give their debate. This can be quite difficult for some of them, so perhaps choose some stronger students the first time. Hopefully all the activities you've prepared them with previously, the mini discussions, the repeating, the mini presentations, will have strengthened their confidence so they can do this. And they give their presentations in front of the class. You can toss a coin to see who goes first, whether it's the side for or against the idea they're presenting. And all of the other students should be listening very carefully and taking notes, because at the end of the discussion, they will have to ask some questions, and hopefully this will develop into a lively class debate. Your role during this activity is absolutely not to stop and correct them if they make mistakes, because the objective here is to build their confidence and to get them speaking in public, okay? I also teach public speaking, and I've done this with teams of top management who have to go and negotiate internationally. And many people today have a real problem with having to do this in English. So if you can get your students to speak publicly in class with confidence, you're giving them an absolute gift for the future, okay? Can't emphasize that enough. So they have a lively class debate. If nobody wants to ask a question, maybe you can think of one or two. If they all start shouting and talking over each other, you can maybe manage the situation a bit. But hopefully you will have a great lively class discussion. And at the end, they all get to vote. They have a secret vote where they should write yes or no, or whatever answer corresponds to the subject they've been discussing. And then you can count up the votes and see which side has won. And I can guarantee that the team that won the argument will be very gratified by this. You know, I did this activity in class a long time ago, and I can remember absolutely the thrill of winning a debate. Is something they talk about and they remember many, many years later. You need to leave time at the end for some feedback. Now, I have seen other materials in Italian explaining to teachers how to conduct debates in class. And I've seen things where they've said, oh yes, you should do maybe 1 minute and do lots of mini debates in class and leave, you know, 1 minute for the actual discussion. I really think that if you have done all your little activities during the year, when it comes to the big day, it's much more satisfying for you to do a debate, just one single debate during the lesson, because they really have a chance to give their presentations, to use their visual material, to talk about it, and you have a chance for the question and answer session at the end, and they really have a chance to get to grips with this discussion, okay? But as I said, leave time for feedback at the end, and I've included a quotation here, which is, the aim of the argument or of discussion should not be victory, but of progress. Now, obviously, the team who wins the debate will be very, very pleased with themselves. But what is crucial in your feedback is how the students perform the task. Okay, so absolutely avoid any criticism. You must not say things like, Giovanni, don't forget that the third person singular in the present tense has an S on the end. That's not important at this stage. What you're looking at is their debating skills and the kind of debating language they used. I think the best thing for you to do is, first of all, to ask the teams themselves to self-appraise and say, okay, the team who argued that there will be driverless cars in 10 years' time, how do you think you performed? What bits did you like about your presentations? Is there anything you think you could have done better? And usually students have something to say about that. Usually they say, oh, wish we'd said this or done that. And remember that at the end of the debate, they will have seen their opponent's presentations. And they'll probably be thinking, oh, I wish we'd done that. So they can actually give a self-appraisal, which will be useful for everybody. You can then ask for some feedback from the class. Again, this should always be constructive criticism. And remind the class that one day it will be them standing at the front and giving a presentation. So the emphasis should be, which parts of this presentation did you like? And which parts do you think could have been improved? Okay. At this stage, it doesn't matter if the language they're using is quite simple. All of this will depend on whether you are teaching in a liceo linguistico or in a different type of school. Even if the debate happens on quite a simple level, what is fundamental is that they are using the language and they are discussing, talking, arguing in a meaningful way in English. That is the focus of this activity, okay? And this is what will help them in the future, all right? Of course, their mistakes, their grammatical errors, linguistic errors are important. So at some point you will need to correct them. If there is time at the end of the debate, you could do this anonymously. While you are listening and monitoring them, you could make some notes of any repeated common errors that you hear during the exercise, and you could make a note of these and write them down, and then very simply put them up on the board and ask the class to correct these as a group, and then you can have people come up to the front and correct the mistakes that they see on the board. Alternatively, if you want to dedicate more time to the activity itself, you can just make a list for yourself of the activities that they perform, of the mistakes that they make, and then you can prepare a little worksheet like this, which they can do the following lesson, or could be a homework activity. And this is something I downloaded for the internet, so these particular sentences are not relevant to a presentation situation, but you could create something like this and they could correct it together in class or as a homework activity, okay? This type of activity is a much more effective way of correcting their mistakes than just telling them they're wrong during the actual lesson, okay? And then when you've done that, you have a wealth of spin-offs and consolidation activities you can do. As I mentioned before, I'm also an IELTS examiner, and I've left myself some time to talk about this because one of the things we see frequently when the IELTS exam, if you don't know, is an exam that you need if you want to go and study abroad, or after Brexit it will be something you'll need to get into the UK in the future. So one thing they have to do is to write an essay. And I don't know if in Italy you have a different idea about what makes a good essay. In Anglo-Saxon companies, we like essays to be organised in very clear paragraphs. And we really like people to consider both sides of the argument and to maybe debunk the viewpoint they don't agree with right at the beginning. So all of the activities we looked at before, for example, the brainstorming activity, that is also a way of organising an essay. So all the ideas against your viewpoint, you could consider those, and all the persuasive language we used, all of these things are vital for writing good essays. Once your students have learned all the topic vocabulary, in the example I gave, everything to do with the environment, you've given them the language of agreeing and disagreeing and expressing opinions. You've built up their confidence during the year with these little mini activities. As a team, they have prepared, presented and debated a particular subject or thought-provoking idea. If you then give them that as a homework topic for an essay, it will be easy for them to write an excellent essay for you, and much more satisfying compared to other activities they might have done. So that's one thing you can do. The other activity you can do as a spin-off, which is my favourite of all, is to make a video. Now, if you plan this during the year and you have various groups presenting during the year, and if you choose to do these debates perhaps at the end of a term, so just before Christmas, just before Easter, as a holiday homework, your presenting group could then go home and make a video of their presentations. And believe me, they will love this activity because they're all very skilled at filming themselves with their smartphones. My 11-year-old daughter made a little video with her friend with horror music and all kinds of special effects. They can do that really effectively. And this is also a fantastic activity because very often when they've done their presentations, they'd like to have a chance to do it better. So if they work on this as a holiday assignment, which can be part of their coursework, they get a chance to do it again and do it better. And once again, it consolidates all the language they've used, and it's another way of repeating everything. And believe me, they will never forget this. I mean, this language they've used and used to talk about in public, they'll remember it when they're my age, okay? So, going over everything we've said, the first thing you do is to prepare them really well with the vocabulary related to each topic that you have during your course, with lots of speaking activities to memorize the vocabulary. You need to give them the language of expressing opinions, of agreeing and disagreeing, and you can do that at various times to practice the topic vocabulary. You need to give them the language of persuasion, debunking the opposite viewpoint, using emotive language, engaging the audience by repeating over and over again their key ideas. And then you need to get them to do mini presentations, just two people working together, so that again they repeat and repeat that language, and they do it in a situation that is comfortable for them, particularly for the weaker students. You gradually build them up for the big day. The team that will be presenting go home, prepare their presentations with any means or materials. It can be just with visual pictures and a blackboard if that's all you have, a whiteboard or a PowerPoint presentation if you're able to do that. The other students go home, they read up on the subject and prepare their questions. On the day of the debate, they give their presentations. Other students listen actively. Active listening is a vital skill for video conferences in the future. They write down notes. At the end, they have a chance to ask them. You develop the debate. Meanwhile, you as teachers are just monitoring, writing down any little mistakes for the feedback. You give them a chance to feedback, in which, first of all, they feedback on themselves. So they do their self-appraisals and say what they liked or didn't like about their own work. You then get the class to feedback. And finally, of course, you have the vote, so you see which side wins. And finally, you can move on to correcting their mistakes, either during lesson time or as a homework activity. And then you have your fantastic spin-offs and consolidations, which can be an essay for everyone, and in particular, making a video for the presenters. And by the end of the entire course, so the 2 or 3 year period, every student in the class will have presented and will have produced a video, and they'll be really pleased with themselves when they've managed to do that. Okay, so you're giving them language and life skills. Now, that's just about all I have to say now, and I think we have 15 minutes for some questions. So I'll ask my collaborators to send me some questions from you. Okay, the first one I can see is, what if in a group of mixed ability students there are the weaker ones that do not speak? They let all the others, the best ones, speak all the time. How can I cope with this? Now, I did cover this in some way during the presentation, but it is something that needs to be reinforced. This is the key problem, and I think that you need to really integrate those small activities all the way through the year, okay? It's very important that you get those weaker students to speak, because by speaking, they will become less weak. You'll reinforce their confidence and their language ability at the same time, okay? So in terms of the big debate, you can schedule maybe their moment for later during the course, but absolutely keep making them speak during the lesson in a situation that is non-threatening for them. So with pair work, if they can get to speak with pair work, and remember, if you put a weak student with a strong student, that is a really valuable activity also for the strong student. I have 2 daughters, they're both bilingual, and thank goodness their teachers frequently ask them to work with the weaker students, and it's useful for my daughters too, because when we explain something to somebody, it helps to reinforce what we know. I could see how frequently, another question I can see, how frequently should we have this kind of activity in our class? Speaking activities every lesson. I think every lesson. Now, maybe you could think about some of the activities that you already do. Maybe you like to use translation. I know that many teachers like to use translation. It's a fantastic brain training, and it does enable students to really get to grips with the language. But I feel that it's a less meaningful activity if you think about the kind of things they'll have to do in later life compared to a debate. So maybe instead of giving them a translation to do, you could try and insert some of these activities I've given you today. And really, I think there should be some kind of information exchange or speaking activity every single lesson, because this goes back to the idea of passive use of English and active use of English. What we know passively, what we can read and understand, or what we can hear and understand, is a vast amount of language compared to what we can produce. So you need to get students to produce language in the lesson, okay? They need to be speaking in the lesson. Now, another question I can see here is, how long should a debate in class last? Again, as I think I said during, I can't remember what I just said now, but I know that I have seen some Italian materials for teachers in which it suggested having lots of mini debates, where the presentations just last for 1 minute. Now, I have a very clear memory of a class that I did at school when I was 16, and we debated, the subject was Christmas has become totally commercial, yes or no? So I can remember that even though I was only 16, and believe me, that was a long time ago. And we took a whole lesson to do that with time for feedback. So I'm not sure exactly how long your lessons last, but if the presentations themselves are, so the side for and against are 2 or 3 minutes each, or maybe a little longer, it depends. You need to leave at least 20 minutes for the actual discussion, for when they start asking and answering questions. If it is a debate that you know they will have a lot to talk about, something maybe related to social media, okay, then leave a long time for that actual discussion and debating in class, because you'll find that students will want to say things. And again, to include the weaker students, you know, you can be a little bit of a monitor, of a manager in this situation. You can say, hang on a minute, there's Elena who wants to ask a question. Can everybody be quiet so Elena can speak? Something like that, just to make sure the weaker ones are included. I've seen a really important question here. Do you think debating is too difficult for junior high school students? I mean for students between the age of 11 and 14. I myself am about to start a series of workshops with students of that age. I'm asking myself that very question, so I'm glad you answered me that. Students can do anything if you motivate them to do it. Now, obviously, with students who are 11, 12, 13, 14, the level of language will be much simpler. So you need to take out some of those more complicated phrases that I gave you as examples. But if you can get your students to just practice with really simple language and say, yes, you're right, I think the same thing, or no, you're wrong, I think blah, blah, blah. And if you can get them to do that when they're quite young, by the time they're 16, 17, 18, this will be easy for them. So I don't think it's too young to start now. All these speaking activities are really, really important. Let me see how much time I've got left. Oh, yes, I have a few more minutes. It's too complicated for my students. Could you suggest other activities? They do not have enough language knowledge and fluency to start a debate. Okay, I know it depends on your on the kind of school you're working in. I know that if you are in a class with students who are, you know, not so fluent and maybe who are not really used to debating in any general sense, it can be really difficult. Why don't you start them with some simple information exchange activities? For example, you could prepare at the very beginning, as part of your, you know, when you're giving them those vocabulary exercises, one really good consolidating activity you can do is a simple information exchange where you provide a very simple written text, okay, about the topic they've been studying. Let's go back to the environment. You write a very, very simple text with simple language structures, which is divided in 2 halves, and maybe the top half is for student A, and there are some pieces of information missing, and for student B they have exactly the same text, and the bottom half of the text has some pieces of clue information missing. And the students have to prepare some questions. To make this really easy, you could put all the student A's together. So if they see a sentence like, to use renewable energy, we need technology like space, space, space. And they have to invent a question, for example, what type of technology do we need to use renewable energy? Student B will know that the answer is solar panels, wind turbines, what was the other one? Hydroelectric dams, I don't know, whatever it is you suggest. And then when they have prepared their questions, you mix up the groups. You put student A with student B. They ask and answer their questions. And so they're simply practicing asking questions, listening to the answer, and completing their texts. At the end, student B and student A will put their two texts together and compare them and see if they've written the right language. Now, this is a very basic activity which you can definitely do also with younger students, just to get them used to speaking together, okay? Again, while they are performing the actual speaking activity and while they're speaking together, you simply walk around the room and monitoring them, write down their repeated mistakes. You should give some flexibility if they just forget the S on the third person singular once or twice, and then correct that as a joint class activity. The emphasis has to be on group work, collaboration, helping each other. And this is my personal quest, because in today, in the age of social media, you know, we're all increasingly isolated. So get them to work together and help each other, and it will really consolidate the language. I've got a fantastic question here. Would you suggest the use of literary topics for students of the last classes? Definitely, definitely. Literary topics, films, anything, pictures, paintings, artwork, as long as you teach them the vocabulary to talk about those things. So obviously, if they're going to have a debate about a literary subject, wonderful idea, then they need to have the language to discuss literature, poetry, prose, style, alliteration, rhythm for a poem, for example, something to do with the writer, something about his or her historical context. As long as you prepare that well in advance, then by all means do it. The same could be, you could prepare some history of art, you know, give them some paintings to talk about, you know, talk about modern art. Is this art or not? But then again, you need to prepare them with the language to do it. Now, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for participating. I have a lot of questions here that I need to answer. So what I will do now is read some of your questions and perhaps prepare some more answers for you in a handout, which will be available on the website together with the presentation for you to download and read. Okay? Thank you very much for participating today. That's it.